My name is Inès Otosaka. I'm a glaciologist working at the Center for Polar Observation and Modeling based at Northumbria University in Newcastle. And I work with satellite data to look at the big ice sheets, Antarctica, which is centered around the South Pole, and Greenland in the Arctic. So I'm joined today by Joshua Gribbon, an aerospace engineer and PhD student in satellite networking, who's studying how to model cooperation between satellite constellations. I'm also joined by Frances McGinley, a postgraduate researcher at Edinburgh, who works on developing satellite instruments to detect greenhouse gases. And finally, we also have on the call Callum O'Connell, who works as an extrusion and sourcing manager at Notpla, which is an innovative startup based in London, aiming at developing sustainable alternatives to plastic packaging. During this panel, you're going to hear about different ways we can protect our planet by using or developing new technologies. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. So we're going to talk you through our own trajectories and also discussing pathways into working in this sector, so in technology for work for protecting our planet. We hope to share with all of you online some of the exciting parts of our jobs, and we'll end with a Q&A, so don't hesitate to ask us any questions. So I'll start by introducing myself and telling you a bit more about what I do as my job and how I got there. So I am a glaciologist at Northumbria University, and I use technology, mainly satellite technology and satellite data, to monitor changes in the polar ice sheets. What you can see now is the videos that I took when I went to Greenland in the Arctic a couple of years ago to collect some measurements to basically make sure that what we measure from space is also corresponds to what we measure from the ground. And that's one of the most exciting parts of my job. But making measurements in Greenland is not a typical day in my job. My job is actually very varied, and being a glaciologist working at a university means that I basically do some research. And my research is looking at the ice sheets from space. So I look at Greenland, so that's what you can see here, and I look at how much they melt. So all of the red areas in Greenland is areas that we have monitored and that we found are melting rapidly. And that the same here in Antarctica in the southern hemisphere. And all of the reds showing here is melting. And the ice sheets are melting quite rapidly in some regions. Sometimes they're melting by more than 5 or and up to 10 meters in some specific glaciers that are fast flowing to the ocean. And what's really important is that when they melt, they contribute to rising sea levels. So that's what you can see here on these curves. And you can see that the curve is increasing. So you have an increase in the sea level contribution from the ice sheets. And it's actually really important because it means that you also have increased risk of coastal flooding. So that's what I do in my day-to-day job. Basically, that's the topic that I'm really interested in. But if you had asked me what I wanted to do when I was still in high school, I would have never said glaciologist or climate scientist, or I never even had considered career in technology by that point. So how did I get there? So just to go back to the beginning, so I grew up in northwestern France, and for my A levels, I studied a variety of topics, basically because I didn't really want to choose one. And then I went on to study maths, physics, and chemistry for 2 years in the same town. So that's quite specific in France. It's what we call a preparatory class. And you basically spend 2 years studying really hard to take a competitive exam that will then decide in which engineering school you can go. But at that point, I wasn't even sure that I wanted to become an engineer. I didn't really understand what that meant. And after these 2 years, and I passed the competitive exam, and then I got a place in an engineering school in the south of France, where it was very sunny and again, like very far from any ice or anything like that. So I moved there in south of France, and I was taught again a range of topics, but I still wasn't really convinced that engineering was what I wanted to do as a job. And at that point, I was starting to feel a bit anxious that I hadn't found a passion yet. So I started to think a bit more seriously about this. And I came to the conclusion that what I would like to do and how I could feel maybe fulfilled in a job would be to find a job that could have a positive impact on society. So I decided to do an exchange year in Sweden, in Stockholm. So I moved again, and I tried to specialize in environmental engineering. And that was a really good opportunity for me because what I learned in France was quite theoretical, and what I learned in Sweden was more applied. So I finally found a space where I could put all of the skills that I had learned so far to study a topic that I actually found interesting. And because I wanted to make sure I was making the right choice, I did a 6 month internship at the Dutch Met Office, where I worked on measuring sea ice from space. So here you can see maps that I created based on satellite data. So on the left-hand side is sea ice in the Arctic, and on the right-hand side is sea ice floating around around the Antarctic. And I actually really liked that topic, so I thought, oh, I could go on and study a bit longer. So then I moved to the UK to pursue a PhD in Earth observation. So again, working with satellite observations, but this time I decided to focus on ice that is resting on land, so what we call land ice, so Greenland and Antarctica, instead of sea ice, which floats on the oceans. And that worked out quite well because then I went on to become research fellow in the same research center that I still work on. And last year I moved to Newcastle to become a lecturer. So I keep on doing some research. And I also have to teach because now I also teach to undergraduate students at university. And my job is actually very varied. I have lots of different tasks that I need to do and that I enjoy doing. Most of my days, I spend a large proportion of my time working on my computer, processing satellite data over the polar regions to monitor how they're changing. And sometimes I'm lucky enough to go to these really remote places. So that's pictures of me in the field collecting measurements and doing some analysis in Greenland and in Antarctica. And other highlights from my job is to go to scientific conferences, to exchange ideas and meet with other researchers from all over the world. And just a couple of months ago, for instance, I was in Iceland at a conference organized by the space agencies ESA and NASA. And sometimes I also feel that my job has a real impact on society, which was what I was looking for. And I can actually contribute in my own way to protecting the planet. And for instance, last year I was invited to the UK Parliament to provide evidence as to why we need to keep studying the polar regions. And that's really important because what's happening in the polar regions is not just staying there, but it's also affecting us here in the UK. So that's all about myself. So I'll now give the floor to Joshua, who's going to tell you more about his career and how he got there.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Josh. I'm a PhD student at the University of Strathclyde. So I am from a place called Coatbridge, which is a little place near Glasgow, right here. And that is where I spent most of my life for a good portion of it. So I took a pretty unusual route through to my career where I am today. When I left high school, I didn't have any hires, I didn't have any higher qualifications because I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I always had this kind of passion for space, but I never felt I was very good at the exams and these parts of school. So I left school and went and worked in various other jobs in call centres or working for the Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games. And that's where I met someone who kind of encouraged me to get back into education and go and do something. I always had a passion for space. And at that time, the European Space Agency had just succeeded in landing a lander on a comet and taking a sample from it. So that kind of really inspired me to get back into education and follow that kind of route. So I went to the University of Glasgow. There was a lot of education I had to do before that. I had to go back and get hires and go to college and got a qualification in aircraft engineering, which then let me get into a master's in engineering at a master's in aerospace systems at the University of Glasgow. And then I proceeded into a PhD at the University of Strathclyde because I learned while I was at university that I really enjoyed learning. I enjoyed reading about things, and I enjoyed learning about the kind of cutting edge technologies and being at the forefront of where the research is. That was really exciting to me. So I pursued a PhD in satellite networking. So basically what my research revolves around is trying to model Earth's orbital environment in a unique way so that I can assess any opportunities for cooperation in orbit. People might be aware that there's a lot of satellites in orbit. Companies now, satellites are much more accessible now, easier to manufacture than they were 20, 30 years ago. And so companies can send them up for all sorts of different tasks. But there might be opportunities for these companies to cooperate while they're in orbit that can reduce the amount of satellites that we're sending up there and increase the benefits that we get from them. And that's what my research really revolves around. This year, I also had the opportunity to become what's called an analog astronaut. As part of my PhD studies, I received some funding to travel to a place called Piła in Poland, where I lived and worked and researched in a low fidelity lunar habitat simulation. So I worked with a crew of 5 other international analog astronauts, and we performed lots of research experiments, questionnaires, and studies into how teamwork evolves in an isolated environment, so that these procedures can then be implemented in real space travel missions. That was a very exciting part of my PhD, and is a kind of taste of the kind of unique things that you get to do when you're in postgraduate research, if you can find the funding to do them. So I'll tell you a little bit about the lab that I work in. It's called the Applied Space Technologies Laboratory. And as I said before, space is becoming much more accessible. The invention of things like CubeSats have made it much cheaper for companies to receive space data. But then also companies exist now for the sole purpose of collecting space data. They'll send satellites up, gather lots of images or other data, and then they can sell that data to companies to gain insights into whatever it is they're looking for, whether that be to analyze a certain geographical part of the Earth, or in some cases to analyze what one good example is how full car parks are at certain times of the day can indicate when companies are making the most money. So really unique use cases for satellite data like that. And we try and come up with more interesting use cases and more interesting ways that satellite data can be used. A couple of examples here. On the upper left, it kind of looks like an atom. This is an image showing the different kinds of communities that form when you look at large satellite constellations. If they're all sharing data with each other, certain parts of those architectures will be much more efficient than other parts. And this is a way of kind of showing what communities communicate with others in that architecture. Next to that is it kind of looks a bit like the Death Star. It's a big blue ball with some lines drawn on it. This is an image from my research, which is how I model Earth's orbital environment by imagining all the satellites to exist on shells that exist around the Earth, and then you collapse them all together to get this strange kind of ball with all these lines moving around it. You can determine when satellites are in contact with an image like that. And the one below that, it's a very interesting thing that the team are working on, where we're detecting ships out on the sea, and these ships using satellite data, of course, these ships are not using their transponders, so they have switched off their transponders, so they aren't broadcasting their location to anyone, which in most cases is illegal. And satellite data can help detect not only the ships, but can detect what kind of fumes are being spent by these ships, and the kind of environmental impact that these ships that are unregulated might be having on the atmosphere, what kind of greenhouse gases they might be releasing, or other gases, other harmful components into the ocean or into the atmosphere. So that's a very exciting, that's the kind of stuff that our team is working on each day. And then my final thing I'm going to talk about is my analog astronaut mission. So this was a 2-week long isolation, complete social isolation, in an old disused sort of a Soviet aircraft hangar in Poland, and that had all been kitted out with lots of experimental equipment and fans and sensors and these kinds of things, so that you're completely self-sufficient in here. My role was the executive officer, so I was in charge of making sure that everyone who was involved in the mission who was doing a research project got some useful outputs from those projects. So that would include things like growing plants in complete isolation. So when you don't have access to sunlight, you use what's called a hydroponics or aeroponics system, where you can essentially grow plants using UV light and nutrient water without any soil. But we also attempted using, we had a box of meteorite soil or crushed meteorite, which we could mix with compost and soil to see if plants could pull nutrients out of it. So it was very interesting. We also had architecture based research, which was how different crew members used different parts of the habitat. For example, some people might use the computer labs more than the bio labs, or might use the workshop more than the engineering facilities. And so you could analyze how people used it. And that was a really interesting overlap for how analog astronaut habitats are used. It's not just about space systems and space missions, but you can get some really unique insights into how humans work together, the psychology of how humans work, but also things like using sensors to monitor human health. So we were wearing wearables, smartwatches, and things like this the whole time, and they could we would have our blood pressure and things like that taken multiple times each day, and using that you could assess how healthy an individual was, how stressed out they were throughout the course of the mission, and these have implications for not only space missions but also healthcare in the real world as well. So it was a really interesting experiment. We had lots of simulated moonwalks. There's a little video there you can see of us out on our moonwalk. We were given 5 minutes to kind of just have some fun. Incredibly unique experience, and it's a small example of the kind of things you get to do as a postgraduate researcher. These opportunities are open for you if you have research to do, and if you can get people to give you money to go and do it, because they're not cheap. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I just finished this analog astronaut mission. I'm back into research, going to conferences and writing papers. A day in the life for me is typically just reading lots of papers, trying to find how my research work can fill some of the gaps that are in literature. You write up some papers and you deliver that information to as many people as you can, and try and make your contribution to the cutting edge of space technology. So yeah, that's all of it from me. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Josh. That was really exciting. And hopefully we'll get the chance for a few more questions about your experience as an analog astronaut. That's really fascinating. So now we move to our next panelist, Frances, who's also doing some very exciting work to protect our planet.
Hi, I'm Frances, and I am also a postgraduate researcher, but I'm not doing a PhD. And I work at the University of Edinburgh as part of a team helping to develop satellite instruments to detect greenhouse gases. So yeah, this is a picture of one that we're developing at the moment that will eventually be used to detect methane. And I'll speak a bit more about that in a second. But I only graduated from university this past summer, so I really feel like I'm at the beginning of my career. So let me talk about how I got here. So at school, when I was growing up, I moved around a lot. So I don't know, there's a list of places I lived, and I went to over 10 different schools. The whole time I did a whole range of subjects, of course, but I really liked science and maths, but I also liked other things like art. And when I say I like science, I really liked biology and not physics. When I was picking my subjects, I was living in the Netherlands, and when I wanted to do biology, I also had to do physics. That was just how it worked at that school. And I was really disappointed because I thought that was going to be way too hard and not fun at all. So I reluctantly agreed. But then just through doing it, I discovered, and having some good teachers, somehow physics became fun. And I also just wanted to say I did some other things, like I did Earth Club and basketball, so I had other interests. But the whole time I didn't know at all what I wanted to do at university. But then somehow physics ended up being the thing I chose. I think it was because I thought it was still really hard and challenging, and I just thought that would be something worth spending a couple more years on. So I took a chance and studied at uni, and I came here to where I am now as well, the University of Edinburgh, where I did a physics integrated master's, which was a 5-year program. And I kind of picked that as well because I didn't know what was going to come next. And I thought, let me just stretch out this university thing for as long as possible and see what happens. And I really enjoyed studying, and I got to do a whole bunch of things I had never done before. So it's part of my physics degree. I had spent time in a lab. So that's a picture of me in an optics lab, everyone wearing hairnets, of course. And then I also did they taught us how to code. So there's a picture there of just a simulation of the solar system we got to do in second year. So that was really fun. And I had no coding experience before that at all. But throughout my degree, I still, again, no idea what was next. And from my degree, I had done a lot of really theoretical courses, and I decided that I wanted to do something that was a bit more applied, where I could see the impact a bit more. And also from my time before, I'd already in things like Earth Club, and just always I thought it would be interesting to work in the climate sector, have some type of impact to help mitigate the effects of climate change. So I thought maybe if there was a way I could combine coding and climate, that would be really cool. So in my final year, I was on the lookout for some type of project that I could do to combine those two interests, and help see what was next. And luckily, when I was picking my master's project in my final year, there was this one where I could help design a satellite to detect methane leaks from the oil and gas industry. So I did that, and then I've now graduated, and I'm continuing that research. So I got quite lucky where I got to just continue my project for another year. So that's what I'm doing now. As part of this team, like I said, we're developing these instruments that will eventually be placed on satellites to detect greenhouse gases. So methane is a really potent greenhouse gas, but it's short-lived. So if we're able to reduce the amount of methane going into the atmosphere, it will really help mitigate the effects of climate change, because it won't stay there for very long. And having good high-quality satellite data will help us identify where these emissions are coming from, especially because a lot of companies do report their emissions, but that data is not very good. So it's good to have satellite data that can see it from space to assess the quality and to confirm, so we can also, it can help drive effective policy so we can address these emissions. So in any case, my team is building an instrument at the moment to detect methane leaks, and then also one for NO2. I do a lot of coding still. So like I said, I enjoyed coding. And so what I do is a lot of observation simulation modeling. So we don't actually have this satellite yet. I do a lot of modeling for what these observations might look like. So at the bottom, there are some plumes, and it's really cool because I do this like modeling stuff, and then the other part of my team does the actual field work. So they go out and they can see if the stuff I've modeled actually is right. And then we kind of work in a circle. Well, I'll model something, and then they can go and do field work, and then we can improve this instrument we're building, and then it kind of works in a circle. And that's really cool. And that's something I really enjoy. So yeah, that's what I do. And that's me. Yeah.
Thank you, Frances. And really interesting also to hear how you went from not finding physics fun to graduating with a physics integrated master's. So our final panelist is Callum, who is going to tell us more about his career and how he tackles plastic pollution in his job using seaweeds.
Hi there. Sorry about that. Hi, my name's Callum. I'm a extrusion technologist at a materials science company called Northumbria. So we look at making replacements to single-use plastic packaging using natural polymers. So I'm going to go a bit through my background and how I got from my beginnings as a marine biologist to now working as a material technologist. So a bit of context, I had always had an interest in marine related things. And when it came time to go through to my A levels, I was still a bit undecided, and I went down, like I knew I wanted to have a science, so I did biology, but I was not that keen on chemistry or maths, so I avoided them. In hindsight, might have been a better idea. But even though I took psychology and history, it still gave me the requisite amount of science background to apply for a scientific-based degree. So when it came time to choosing my degree, I was still going more on what I was interested in, had a good feeling about. So I settled on marine biology, so moved up to the University of Newcastle, and I was just quite open to the idea of exploring different things. And I realized quite early on that I enjoyed lab work. And early on in my undergraduate course, I reached out to a couple of professors, and they were kind enough to let me do some volunteering in their lab. So just assisting some of their PhD students, but through that process, I was able to get some additional exposure to how to work in a lab, but also some technical skills around bacteria, but also working with DNA and other quite precise, complicated techniques that might not have been on my core curriculum. So it was more based on these extracurricular activities during my degree that made me realize that I was quite interested in the applied science aspect of it. And I came to the end of my undergraduate, and I was deciding if I wanted to then go into industry or stay in academia. And it's already been said before, but I found the idea of staying in academia a bit easier at the time. So I did what's called a MPhil. Basically, that means it's like a shortened version of a PhD where you're not publishing any research, you're just doing a master's. It's over 2 years and it's purely research based. And my thinking was that I would be able to see if that would be an interesting path for me, and whether or not I would then like to pursue a PhD subsequent to that. I realized whilst it was very fun, I got to learn a lot of interesting things, working with different bacterias, and seeing how the marine environment is impacted by plastics and how the environment responds to it. Further academia was not for me. And so my thinking was, okay, I still like working in a lab. What can I do next? And whilst I was deciding exactly where to go, I got a brief job working in the food industry. It was probably one of the more interesting jobs I've had, and people ask me why I didn't stay in it. But essentially, I was using my lab-based skills to work as a lab technician at a company that makes seasonings for crisps. So whilst it was very fun, I thought that it would be nice to return to marine science. And then just around the time that I was finishing writing up my master's, there was a marine research organization up in the Highlands of Scotland that was looking for research associates to help them studying seaweed diseases. And based on my master's and my undergraduate, working a lot with bacteria, cultivation strategies, and also molecular techniques, I got a job as a research assistant studying how seaweed diseases affect different types of populations, but also ones from across the world. So I was working with temperate, big brown seaweeds that you find in the UK, and then also with the red seaweeds that you would find in Indonesia and the Philippines. So it was a fascinating experience. I got to do a lot of hands-on practical work at the seaweed farm that my organization ran. And because it was project-based, around the time that that project was coming to an end, I found out that the commercial part of the company of the organization was going to set up a commercial seaweed farm. So based on my cultivation work, I thought, okay, I don't have much business experience. It'd be interesting to apply again. So again, just kind of taking the opportunities as they came. I ended up running the first seaweed nursery in the UK. So there's image on the right with the red lights. It's me growing the seed stock that a farmer would use to plant on his lines in the sea, which would then grow into the seaweed that he would then hopefully sell on. And it was a brilliant experience. I got to meet a lot of very interesting people. It's still a very small industry, particularly in the UK. But I was also at that time starting to think, okay, what else can I look at? Because I'd spent this whilst this was in the business area. There was still a lot of association with the research side. I was quite interested in seeing how I could translate that to a downstream technology. So in 2022, sorry, I found out about this company down in London that was using the seaweed to make a plastic replacement in single-use packaging. And this kind of reminded me back to my time during my master's where I was studying. Sorry?
We're running a bit out of time, so maybe you could put a link to what the really interesting things that NOPLA are doing in the chat, so that then people can check that later. But I already learned a lot about your job, and seaweed really are really amazing. I'm sorry that we have to stop in just 1 minute. So we've heard from all of our panels and we got some really interesting questions. We won't have time to go through those questions, unfortunately, but it was really interesting. And maybe if one of you just wants to answer a very quick question that we got in the chat and give it a go at answering what was the main key success for your success in your studies or in your current job, or just finding something that you enjoy doing. Just like one very short advice maybe for our audience online.
I'm happy to have a go. I think the number one piece of advice from me would be to just follow your interests. A big part of why I never got my qualifications back when I should have is that I was a little bit self-conscious about following what I was interested in. I was really interested in space and science and maths, and that wasn't a cool thing to do at the time. And I really wish that I had. And since I decided to go back into education and really enjoyed reading about space and learning about space and all the new technologies and stuff, that's what really drives you to chase opportunities that you see and do things that you wouldn't normally do because you're really interested in them, and it really makes you go for it. So yeah, follow your interests. Whatever you're interested in, go for it.
Thanks, Josh. I think it's a great piece of advice to end this panel. And the next panel is going to be looking how we can protect the planet through engineering. So stay tuned for this. And running in parallel, there's also going to be a session on climate detective kits and on how to take part in the ESA Climate Detectives Challenge. Thank you for joining us online and for listening to our stories.